The first time he saw her, it was as if the world had blurred around her and only she remained in sharp focus. The gallery was buzzing with muted conversations and the soft clinking of wine glasses, but he barely registered any of it. His eyes were drawn to the way she stood near the abstract paintings, her posture effortless, confident, yet somehow approachable. There was a natural grace in her movements, the way she tilted her head slightly to examine a brushstroke, the subtle arch of her brow as she considered a piece of art, and the soft curve of her lips hinting at amusement that only she understood. She was older than him, and he noticed it, not in a way that intimidated, but in the quiet authority and maturity that radiated from her presence. Her hair, dark with strands of silver, fell loosely around her shoulders, catching the gallery lights in gentle highlights. Her fingers, stained faintly with paint, absent-mindedly traced the edge of a canvas, as though she could feel the emotions embedded in it. He felt a pang of curiosity, a magnetic pull that made him want to know her, to understand what thoughts stirred behind those keen, observant eyes. Their first interaction was accidental, yet unforgettable. He had been reaching for a pamphlet when their hands brushed for a fraction of a second. It was light, almost inconsequential, but the warmth of her skin sent a ripple of awareness through him. He pulled back, slightly flustered, catching her gaze. She didn't withdraw. Instead, she offered a small, knowing smile that suggested she had noticed the same spark of electricity he had felt. Her eyes lingered on his just a moment too long, and in that instant, something unspoken passed between them, a quiet recognition of curiosity, a subtle invitation that he wasn't sure he was ready to accept. He found himself watching her from across the room, noticing the smallest details. The gentle way she adjusted her scarf, the slight tilt of her shoulder as she reached for a brush, the soft cadence of her laughter when someone made a witty remark. She was confident, undeniably skilled in her art, yet there was a quiet vulnerability in the way she sometimes glanced at her own hands, as if questioning the stroke she had made. It was humanizing, and it drew him closer in thought, even when distance separated them physically. There was a scent that clung faintly to her, a mix of her perfume and something earthy, reminiscent of wet paint and varnish, grounding and intoxicating at the same time. He wondered, not for the first time, how it would feel to be closer, to speak more than a casual greeting, to let the conversation flow like the brush on her canvases. But hesitation lingered. He was aware of the unspoken rules, the distancing years, and the social weight of stepping forward. And yet, even as he hesitated, the pull was undeniable. By the time the gallery lights dimmed slightly in preparation for the evening's closing, he realized that curiosity had turned into fascination. She had left an impression that was deeper than mere attraction. It was the promise of something complex, meaningful, and entirely his to discover. And he knew, almost instinctively, that this encounter was only the beginning. A few days after the gallery encounter, a message appeared, simple and unexpected. Asterisk, I noticed your curiosity the other day. Would you like to visit my studio? Asterisk, he stared at the words, heart quickening. Not from nervousness alone, but from the undeniable thrill that had lingered since the first meeting. The thought of stepping into her world, a private place where art and emotion intertwined, made him both eager and hesitant. The studio was tucked away in a quiet part of the city, a place that smelled of aged wood, fresh paint, and turpentine, an intoxicating combination that seemed to announce her presence before he even saw her. When he entered, she was there, arranging canvases near a large window where the afternoon light spilled generously across the room. The light caught the golden highlights in her hair, casting a gentle glow that made her seem almost ethereal. She turned at the sound of his steps, and that same confident, magnetic smile greeted him, warm yet teasing. "Welcome," she said, her voice soft but layered with certainty. There was no formal handshake, no distant formality, just an invitation. He felt immediately at ease, as if the studio itself had exhaled in recognition of his presence. Yet beneath that ease, an undercurrent of tension thrummed quietly, like the faint vibration of a tuning fork, felt more in the chest than the ears. She gestured toward a blank canvas propped against an easel. "I thought we could start with something simple," she said, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the canvas as she handed him a brush. The brush was warm in his hand, the bristles soft against his fingertips. Their hands met briefly, just long enough for him to feel the delicate warmth of her skin. A shiver ran through him, a mix of anticipation and the thrill of proximity. As he positioned himself before the canvas, she moved beside him, her shoulder almost brushing his. He could feel the subtle heat radiating from her, a quiet reminder that she was close, very close. Her presence was comforting yet charged, like standing near a gentle flame that could scorch if you leaned too near. She spoke in that same soft, deliberate way, guiding his hand through strokes, her voice a combination of instruction and gentle encouragement. Every time her hand hovered near his, he felt the electricity of a connection unspoken but unmistakable. She watched him, eyes scanning his work, then his expression, then back to the canvas. "Don't worry about perfection," she murmured. "Let the brush speak for you." Her hand lingered near his shoulder as she adjusted his posture slightly, and the warmth of her touch pressed against him more than the skin alone. It carried intent, curiosity, and a subtle invitation he could not ignore. Time seemed to slow. The sunlight shifted, painting golden rectangles across the floor, and they both moved in that quiet rhythm, hands and eyes occasionally brushing, leaning closer without words. Every accidental touch, every glance, was amplified by the tension between curiosity and restraint. By the time he left the studio that evening, his mind was aflame with the memory of the scent of paint, the warmth of her presence, and the thrill of crossing into her private world. It was more than an invitation to paint. It was an invitation to a space where boundaries blurred, where desire and admiration intertwined delicately, and where something unspoken, slowly but insistently, began to grow. The studio felt different that day, quieter, as if it had grown aware of their presence together. He stepped inside, heart still thrumming from the lingering memory of her last smile, and found her already at the easel, brush in hand, the sunlight spilling across her hair in amber streaks. She glanced at him, her eyes softening with recognition, and for a fleeting moment, the outside world, the noise, the expectations, the age gap, slipped away. "Ready to begin?" she asked, her voice gentle, carrying both patience and a quiet authority. He nodded, fumbling slightly as he held the brush, aware of the way her gaze seemed to study him, not critically, but attentively, as though she could see more than just the canvas before him. She moved closer, her fingers brushing the back of his hand as she adjusted his grip. The touch was light, almost accidental, yet it sent a quiet pulse through him, a reminder of the unspoken connection simmering beneath every gesture. The lesson began with simple strokes, lines, curves, blending colors, but it quickly evolved. She encouraged him to close his eyes and let intuition guide his hand. And when he hesitated, she gently rested her hand over his, guiding the brush along the canvas. The warmth of her palm against his, the subtle pressure, felt intimate without words, and he became acutely aware of how close they were, the brush between them a fragile boundary separating curiosity from desire. As the lesson unfolded, conversation wove naturally between them. He found himself sharing small stories, the kind he usually kept private, a memory from childhood, a fleeting regret, a quiet hope. She listened, genuinely interested, her eyes never leaving his, her fingers occasionally brushing stray paint off his wrist. In return, she shared glimpses of herself, her beginnings as an artist, the fears that haunted her, the moments of self-doubt that even her confident exterior could not hide. Each revelation was a bridge, pulling them closer emotionally, allowing trust to grow in a space that was simultaneously creative and personal. The studio seemed alive with their energy. The smell of paint mixed with the faint scent of her perfume, creating an intoxicating atmosphere that made every movement more deliberate, every glance more charged. When she leaned in to show him a technique, her arm brushed his side, and he felt the warmth of her body, the subtle rhythm of her breath. It was enough to stir something deep inside him, an acknowledgement of attraction tempered by the respect he held for her and the hesitancy born of their age difference. By the time the lesson ended, the canvas bore not only the beginnings of a painting, but also traces of their interaction. Brushstrokes that mirrored their laughter, smudges that marked fleeting touches, colors blending like emotions they were only beginning to understand. As he stepped back to admire his work, she met his eyes, her gaze lingering with a quiet intensity that made him acutely aware of both the space between them and the pull toward it. That day, he realized the studio was more than a place for art. It was a sanctuary of trust, a stage for subtle intimacy, and a safe harbor for curiosity and vulnerability. He left with a strange mix of exhilaration and restraint, eager for the next lesson, yet aware of the delicate tension that had begun to thread itself through every interaction. In the quiet of the evening, he replayed every touch, every glance, every unspoken word, understanding that their connection was deepening, slowly, intentionally, and irresistibly. After several lessons, the atmosphere between them had shifted, subtle yet undeniable. The studio, once a place of cautious curiosity, now pulsed with a quiet energy, the kind that made the air seem heavier with possibility. Today, she suggested something different, a playful exercise meant to loosen his style, but it quickly became a dance of awareness, tension, and unspoken desire. "Close your eyes," she instructed, a mischievous lilt in her voice. "Let your hand feel the canvas without thinking too much." He hesitated, feeling a flicker of nervousness. When he complied, she moved closer, her presence enveloping him like sunlight spilling across the room. Her warm breath brushed his ear as she whispered gentle instructions, and he felt the heat rise in his chest. The closeness, though innocent in intent, carried an undercurrent of something electric, stirring sensations he hadn't expected. As he painted blindly, her fingers occasionally hovered near his, adjusting his grip or guiding a stroke. Each touch was fleeting, yet deliberate enough to make him acutely aware of her proximity. The warmth of her hand against his lingered long after she pulled away, leaving a subtle ache, a craving for connection that was both thrilling and terrifying. He noticed every detail about her, the way her hair fell across her shoulder, the tilt of her head as she watched him, the soft curve of her lips when she smiled at a stroke that impressed her. Every gesture seemed charged, yet perfectly natural. Her teasing didn't stop at touch. She leaned in to critique his work, her shoulder brushing against his, her voice low and conspiratorial. "Not quite there, but you're getting closer," she said, eyes glinting with playful challenge. His pulse quickened, not from embarrassment, but from the intimacy of her attention. She had a way of speaking that made him feel seen, understood, and quietly desired, without ever saying it outright. At one point, she asked him to mimic a pose from one of her sketches. Standing side by side, he felt the subtle press of her elbow against his arm, her hand just grazing his as she adjusted his posture. He was acutely aware of how close they were, how natural it felt to share space that was usually personal. Every small movement, every fleeting touch, heightened the tension between them, a slow, delicious pull that neither wanted to name aloud. Even laughter became a tool of intimacy. When he made a playful comment or fumbled a brushstroke, her soft chuckle filled the room, wrapping around him like a warm blanket. Their eyes met repeatedly, holding for just a beat longer than necessary, communicating unspoken words, admiration, intrigue, and something deeper simmering beneath the surface. By the end of the session, the canvas bore the marks of creativity intertwined with subtle connection, strokes that mirrored their laughter, patches of color that mirrored their lingering touches, the unintentional choreography of two people navigating curiosity, attraction, and restraint. As he stepped back to admire the painting, she placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, a simple gesture loaded with meaning. The warmth of her touch lingered, leaving him aware of the slow, steady pull toward her, an attraction tempered by respect, heightened by playful intimacy, and impossible to ignore. He knew, without needing to say it, that their connection had deepened in ways both thrilling and terrifying. The studio was quiet that evening, the golden light of sunset spilling across the floorboards and the canvases that leaned against the walls. The usual hum of the city outside felt distant, irrelevant, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate the fragile intimacy building within these four walls. He arrived with a mix of anticipation and nervous energy, aware that today felt different. The teasing and playful exercises had laid the groundwork, but now there was a palpable tension, a quiet question neither of them had voiced, hovering in the air like a suspended note. She greeted him with the same warm, inviting smile, but there was something softer in her eyes today, a vulnerability that made him notice the slight tremor in her fingers as she set out paints. He realized she, too, felt the weight of the unspoken, the possibility that the connection they had been nurturing was shifting into something more. The lesson began, as usual, guiding his hand along brush strokes, correcting angles, showing him the subtle ways light could change a painting's emotion. But soon, words turned personal. He found himself sharing memories he had never voiced aloud. The quiet loneliness of moving to a new city, the small moments of doubt that had followed him through life, the yearning for connection he had tried to ignore. She listened, her eyes attentive, never interrupting, yet leaning in just enough to make him aware of her proximity. When she spoke, it was with honesty that struck him to the core. She shared fragments of her past, the moments of insecurity behind her confident exterior, the choices that had shaped her life, the longing for understanding that she had rarely found. Her voice, low and measured, carried warmth and sincerity, and when her gaze met his, it was steady, unflinching, and intimate. For the first time, he felt the distance between them dissolve, not entirely, but enough that he could breathe in the same emotional space without fear. At a quiet moment, she reached out, brushing a speck of paint from his cheek. The touch was soft, deliberate, and lingering just long enough to send a shiver down his spine. He became acutely aware of her closeness, the rhythm of her breath, the warmth radiating from her body, the gentle tilt of her head as she watched him. It was a physical presence wrapped in emotional intimacy, a connection that left him both exhilarated and grounded. The rain began outside, its soft patter against the studio windows, adding to the cocooned world they had created. She moved closer, lightly resting her hand near his on the canvas, their fingers nearly brushing. Neither withdrew. Instead, they allowed the moment to stretch, savoring the quiet intensity. Words were no longer necessary. Every glance, every subtle touch, every shared silence spoke volumes about desire, trust, and mutual understanding. By the time the sun had fully dipped below the horizon, the canvas before them bore more than paint. It bore the imprint of connection, strokes that mirrored their laughter, smudges where hands had brushed, the blending of colors like their emotions intertwining. He left the studio that evening with a heart both full and restless, aware that the bond they were forming was deep, complicated, and undeniably real. The first seeds of trust had blossomed into a shared understanding, one that neither age nor hesitation could diminish. The studio was quieter than usual that afternoon, the muted sunlight filtering through the tall windows in soft amber beams. He stepped inside, carrying the familiar mix of anticipation and nervous energy. Today felt heavier, charged, not with playful teasing or casual lessons, but with the weight of what had been simmering between them for weeks. She was there, already at the easel, her movements calm and fluid, yet there was a subtle tension in the set of her shoulders, a quiet vulnerability in her posture that made his chest tighten. She turned toward him as he entered, and their eyes met with a softness that took his breath away. The usual warmth of her smile was there, but beneath it lay something more intimate, more sincere. There was a pause, an unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them. The playful touches, the lingering glances, the emotional honesty they had shared. In that silence, the distance created by age and experience felt less significant, replaced by something more immediate, the undeniable reality of their connection. "Sit," she said softly, gesturing toward a chair near the canvas. Her voice carried warmth, but also a quiet strength, a subtle authority tempered by gentleness. He complied, settling in while she picked up a brush and held it lightly in her fingers. Her hand brushed his as she passed him a palette, and the contact lingered just a moment longer than necessary. The simple warmth of her touch sent a ripple through him, grounding him while simultaneously stirring the desire he had tried to contain. She studied his painting for a moment, then met his gaze directly. "I need to tell you something," she said, her tone calm but layered with emotion. He leaned forward slightly, heart pounding, sensing the gravity of the moment. She spoke slowly, deliberately, revealing a side of herself she had kept carefully guarded. She admitted her fascination with him, not in words of possession, but in terms of admiration, inspiration, and the subtle way his presence had touched her life. Her eyes held his, steady and honest, and for the first time, he saw the vulnerability beneath her confident exterior. He felt a swell of emotion rise inside him. The hesitations, the doubts, the unspoken questions, they all seemed to dissolve in that moment. He responded truthfully, speaking of his own admiration, the quiet longing he had felt from the first encounter, the unexpected depth of connection he hadn't anticipated. Their words were not dramatic declarations, but quiet, sincere acknowledgments that carried the weight of honesty. When she reached out, her hand resting lightly on his chest, he felt her heartbeat, steady and strong. Their fingers intertwined naturally, the physical intimacy simple yet profoundly meaningful. Her touch was a confirmation, a bridge across the emotional space that had grown between them. There was no rush, no pressure, just the warmth of shared understanding and mutual desire, acknowledged and respected. As the light shifted through the windows, bathing the studio in a golden glow, he realized that something fundamental had changed. Their connection was no longer just curiosity, playfulness, or tension. It was trust, understanding, and a quietly mutual longing. The confession had brought clarity and relief, transforming their relationship into something tangible, safe, and deeply intimate. For the first time, he felt fully present with her, aware of the bond that had blossomed slowly, deliberately, and beautifully between them. The studio was bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon, the golden lights spilling across canvases, paint-streaked floors, and scattered brushes. After weeks of hesitant glances, playful teasing, and shared vulnerability, the atmosphere between them had shifted into something steady, comforting, and quietly electric. Today, there was no lesson, no pretense, just presence together in a space that had become their sanctuary. He watched her as she adjusted a canvas, her movements calm yet purposeful. The subtle scent of her perfume mingled with the familiar aroma of paint, grounding him in the moment. She noticed him watching and smiled, a gentle, knowing smile that made his chest tighten with warmth. Without a word, she gestured for him to come closer, and he did, each step deliberate, aware of the subtle rhythm of their shared space. They settled side by side on a low stool near a blank canvas, brushes in hand, letting the quiet intimacy envelop them. There was no need for conversation. The silence was comfortable, heavy with understanding. Occasionally, their hands brushed as they reached for paint, and each touch was a reminder of the trust and connection that had grown between them. The warmth of her fingers against his, the soft pressure of her palm near his own, felt electric yet safe, a delicate balance of desire and respect. She leaned in slightly, whispering a suggestion about a color choice, and he felt the soft brush of her hair against his shoulder. It was unintentional, yet the sensation sent a small thrill through him. He glanced at her, noticing the gentle curve of her lips, the quiet intensity in her eyes, and the way her presence seemed to anchor him. There was no need for words. Every glance, every gesture, every accidental touch communicated volumes. As they painted together, the strokes on the canvas became a metaphor for their relationship, each color blending seamlessly with the next, layers of trust, desire, and understanding building into something beautiful and enduring. Occasionally, their shoulders touched, where their hands lingered near each other, and each contact, however fleeting, deepened the intimacy that had grown so naturally over time. At one point, she rested her hand lightly on his arm, a simple gesture that conveyed more than words ever could. He responded by turning slightly, letting their hands meet fully, fingers intertwining with ease. The warmth of her skin, the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat, the soft weight of her gaze, all combined to create a moment that felt suspended in time. It was a moment of complete understanding, where desire and emotional connection coexisted harmoniously, without pressure or urgency. As the afternoon faded into evening, they leaned back, brushes still in hand, and surveyed the canvas they had created together. It was imperfect, vibrant, and alive, much like their relationship. The room was quiet, filled only with the soft rhythm of their breathing and the faint rustle of paint-stained fingers. He realized then that this was the culmination of everything that had led them here. The curiosity, the playful tension, the vulnerability, and the confession. For the first time, he felt completely at ease in her presence, fully present in the warmth of mutual understanding and quiet affection. There was no rush, no need for dramatic declarations, just the serene knowledge that they had found something rare and precious. As they sat together, hands brushing, shoulders touching, hearts quietly aligned, he knew that this was not the end of their story. It was the beautiful beginning of something enduring, tender, and wholly theirs.